Serious employers of Reddit, what is the weirdest or creepiest thing you've found during a background check on a potential employee? Years ago, was interviewing someone who listed being a supervisor at a Starbucks as part of her resume. Asked her to share a story about tough conflict resolution. She shares that she caught an employee stealing. She said it was tough because she couldn't tell anyone. Why? Because it would get him in trouble. Okay, so how did you deal with it? I tried to talk to him but he wouldn't stop. So then whenever he was going to steal something, I did it for him so he wouldn't get in trouble. There was no sense of wrongdoing on her part. No guilt. Seemed kind of proud of her answer, perhaps thinking I would be quite impressed with how she handled it. I walked out and had a hard time figuring out if this was one of those fancy interview consultants that hire UPS sent to see how we react or if she was just nuts. I once took a resume into a clothing shop that was hiring. I ended up chatting to the guy at the counter for a bit, no customers in the store, and found out he was most likely the one being replaced. He told me he had borrowed $80 from the safe because his house had been broken into and he needed to buy padlocks. He kept going on about how he paid it back on payday, and the only reason he got caught was because someone else was feeling spiteful and tattled on him. He somewhat admitted he knew what he did was wrong, but he honestly felt he shouldn't be fired for it and that it was all this other employee's fault. I just remember walking out of there shaking my head and cringing. I was a hiring manager for a while at my place of employment. Had a decent candidate. He was applying for an overnight position, so his slight lack of social skills wasn't too bad. He had a decent work history and told us he'd been through a recent divorce and had been down on his luck for a while, which explained an 18-month gap in employment. He answered no to the conviction question. His drug test was fine, so I started his background check and told him we'd bring him back in to finish up paperwork once it was returned. 4 days later, the check was still pending, which usually suggests that the candidate has some sort of record and our HR department is investigating. A week and a half passes and candidate has called a few times asking what's up. I have no answer. Finally, I get the big "do not hire" on his status, as well as an email from HR. The email was basically along the lines of "do not hire candidate. Do not contact candidate. If candidate comes into your location, insist he leaves immediately." I never saw the guy after that and I don't know what they found. One time we had this girl come in for an interview and she killed it. Super friendly, professional, well-spoken, and she had experience. Googled her name and immediately found a video of her stealing a butt plug from the local toy place. The company posted it online and all the comments consisted of people naming her because she was well known in the student community. I never felt such intense second-hand embarrassment, and while she was obviously in the wrong to steal, the company publicly shaming her was so unprofessional. Anyway, I hear she moved away after that. Poor girl. No one deserves to lose their rep for life because of one mistake. But also I can understand that the toy place posted it as a warning for others. I agree. I felt really bad for her. Of course it was a bad decision on her part to steal, but that company made an example of her and humiliated her online for all of her friends and family to see. I think it would have been more professional to not post anything online at all instead of making a witch hunt out of it, or to say something like "we need to talk to this person, does anyone know who it is?" People in the comments of the post were calling her into the dirt for shoplifting and she did seem like a nice girl, so it was just an awful situation. Edit. Just checked out the company Twitter and they often post shoplifters on their surveillance and ask for identification. I think they use the public embarrassment as a tactic to deter future shoplifters because they've done it several times, and made the local news for it too because people find it funny. Kind of a method, but I guess it's effective enough for them to keep it up. There is a book by John Ronson, all about the reality of public shaming in the age of the internet. From people lives ruined for misinterpretations, total mistakes, and through to things they did vs and disproportionate reaction, the shaming. The book is So You've Been Publicly Shamed, by John Ronson, Goodreads. Com link, SFW. It's a fantastic book and it really changed the way I thought of people naming and shaming online. As a tidbit from the book, Ronson's research led him to discovering the public shaming, like in medieval Europe, was phased out not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It broke people. And now victims of internet shaming can experience anything from mild inconvenience, to severe disruption in life including loss of job, relationship, friends, etc., to complete destruction in life, entire brand ruined, no longer hireable, previous lived off a reputation that is now in tatters, or even just handled in such a way that the person is totally unable to continue functioning in the real world. And finally, as always, in the worst cases, there is suicide. Anyway, I think now that I'd never deliberately name and shame regardless of the crime. No doxing. There are legal avenues for when people do the wrong thing. Internet vigilantes have no qualifications in law, ethics, sociology, etc. They're not judges. They have no place deciding the punishment someone should endure. There's a justice system in place already, and it's based on tried and tested principles. It may be flawed and definitely imperfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than a medieval-style public humiliation, which is not appropriate in this age and culture. Edit Diops, winky face. I was hiring for a mid-level technology-related position and a middle-aged guy applied. He had a decently relevant background, so I called him in for an interview. You know how they say to bring printed copies of your resume to an interview? This guy had brought several copies printed on resume paper, bound in one of those document folders with the clear front page along with reference letters and app kinds of other stuff. He was really earnest throughout the interview, like trying way too hard. Otherwise he does relatively okay, but definitely not better than the maybe pile. At the end he decides to straight up drop the bombshell that he's a convicted offender due to molesting a child. Then he decided to try and reassure us by telling us that it wasn't like he was out on the streets like a predator, the child was a relative. Like that somehow made it better. Then he proceeded to tell us about all the tax benefits that would be available to us for hiring him. It was really strange. Wasn't in charge of hiring, but I used to run background checks for potential workers and volunteers at an animal shelter. A middle-aged guy wanted to volunteer, and we have to make sure the people don't have any history of animal abuse among other things. Found a nasty and theft charge against him from 10 years prior, and after that it was like the guy completely disappeared off the radar. Had to call and ask him to explain what he did during those years because there might be a mistake. Couldn't get a hold of him. A couple more days pass and I see his mug shot on the news. He was in prison and had just escaped 2 days prior to wanting to volunteer, was on the run. So this man is in jail, doesn't show up on a background check? Good to know. This happened to me in February 2016. This woman interviewed with me and I made her an offer contingent on her passing a state background check. She suddenly tries telling me I don't need to run one on her, in which I reply I absolutely need to, and it was state regulation. She let it go. I run the background, which takes about 2 full business days before I can get the results, and leave my office for the weekend. Come back on the Wednesday afterwards and the background is waiting. There were more red flags than I've ever seen. This was a few of things that came back. Criminal. A pending felony DUI with leaving the scene of an accident. Endangering the welfare of a child. I obviously call the woman and tell her we would not be able to hire her, and she wigs out on the phone, calling me a liar and other nonsense. So I calmly read all of her information she gave me back to her, and she confirmed it all but couldn't explain the results. I stand by my decision and tell her good luck. Wasn't done though, unfortunately. I leave for lunch and come back to my secretary telling me that I had a couple there to see me. Lady shows up with her boyfriend and tries to combo guilt/intimidate me into changing my mind. I read her the state regulations verbatim and tell her it could cost us our provider number. I wish I was making this next part up. With this guy present, she offers me to overlook all of this and hire her. At this point I tell her to leave my office and tell her not to come back. I tell my secretary under no circumstances to let them back into the building and call the executive director and owner to tell them about what happened. During the call I get a post-it note from my secretary who tells me that the couple are out in the parking lot looking around at cars and she called the police. Cops show up and they think of some BS excuse like lost their keys in the lot. I immediately tell the police what happened and they escorted them off the property.